All right, look.
That's me.
If you had to choose,
yeah,
would you rather just watch movies for the rest of your life,
okay,
or only listen to music? One or the other.
Music. Because one of my favorite, like, if I need to, like, just get out of my own head and not think, I'll go on a drive and listen to music. Just, like, go around town for 30 minutes and just not think about anything.
So if they remade and remastered the Lord of the Rings trilogy...
I don't want to talk about it. I understand the implications of this decision. I'm choosing to ignore them for the sake of making the decision as easy as possible.
Okay.
You're going to say movies, aren't you?
I think I might.
Mm-hmm.
Just because...
Because of the Lord of the Rings trilogy.
Well, not so... Well, that's a big part of it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. There's just... It's the visualization. It's the fact that you can get trapped in a world that isn't your own.
I get it. I think for me, it's just the fact that movies, like, if you're going to really get invested in them, involve more thinking.
Yeah. To me, watching movies is more of a prolonged process.
Right.
Like, it takes longer. It takes more time. It takes more effort, to where listening to a song is, I don't want to say temporary.
No, but it's shorter.
It is.
Yeah.
Like,
and I just need that ability to shut my brain off.
Yeah, I get that.
A little bit.
Okay, so let me ask you this. If you had to pick between watching one movie for the rest of your life or listening to one song for the rest of your life.
I assume I get to pick.
You do, yeah, you get to pick.
But I have to pick either.
So if you pick movie, you get to pick the movie. If you pick song, you get to pick the song.
Do I? If I pick movie, am I never listening to music again, or is music still an option?
No, you're never listening. Yeah.
Oh, like.
Yeah, you either watch one movie
with no music, or listen to one song with no movies.
No.
Or the other is still open.
Yeah, the other one's still open.
Okay, so I'm going to pick one movie and just only be able to watch that one. I don't know what movie I would pick, though.
Okay, so if it was the other way around, you only get to pick...
One song ever?
One song ever or one movie ever, and you don't get to listen to or watch the other.
Man, that's like so much entertainment is gone now.
Yeah, but there's your options.
I don't like these options. This is America.
I don't make the rules, man.
You do. You are the questions guy.
I don't see a script.
Well, we don't have a script, but you're the one deciding what the rules are on this.
You don't know that?
I'm not.
Which one, man?
We only have 2 co-hosts.
Which one, man?
I know it's not me.
No, I'm saying movie or song.
Oh, I don't know. That's too restrictive.
Answer the question that people want to know.
I don't think they do. I don't think that's why we're here.
It's just a good segue, man. You're no fun. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Valley Bible Studies Podcast.
You almost messed it up.
Because I was laughing at you.
Mm-hmm.
We're really back. Really glad to be back. We are really back.
This is gonna
we're back.
Gonna be a long one.
It is. I'm tired. We're filming this very close to its release.
We may or may not be like expert procrastinators secretly. So,
like, I'm talking professional.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm getting over a cold. I think you're about to get one.
Yeah, I'm heading that way.
We're both really tired from having long weekends, driving late into the night, getting home late into the night. This might be a wonky episode.
But you know what?
We're here.
Jesus is better. And that's what the book of Hebrews is all about.
It's all about... Talk about segues.
No, seriously, that's what the book of Hebrews is
I know,
about.
I've read it.
Well, that's good.
Okay, fine. So, since you know everything about Hebrews...
No, don't do that. Not even close.
Give us a little outline.
Okay, so Hebrews is a difficult one to outline because Hebrews is so logical. Like, the argument about who Hebrews is written by. We don't know. There's no sure answer on who wrote Hebrews, which makes it the only one in the New Testament that there's not a sure answer on that.
And people have guesses.
There are guesses.
But when it comes to the Bible, I'm not a fan of guesses.
I agree. So I don't know who it was. For my 2 cents, I'm going to say it probably wasn't Paul. That's just my opinion. And the reason I think that is because Hebrews is so, like, point by point.
It's written differently.
Yes.
Yeah.
Paul gets ranty.
Yes.
And Paul follows rabbit holes.
Yes.
Hebrews doesn't do that.
It's a little more linear.
And because it's more linear, it's harder to divide up, like, he doesn't really say, okay, now we're going to talk about this in the same way that Paul does. He just sort of flows from point to point. So the theme of Hebrews is Jesus is better. And the reason that that's the theme is he's writing to Hebrew Christians who are used to Judaism, who were raised in Judaism, converted to Christianity, and are now thinking about going back because of persecution or because Judaism is just easy and what's familiar. And he's writing to them to say, don't go back. Jesus is good enough. He's better than whatever you can come up with yourself, so don't go back to where you were before. And a way to think about how Hebrews is outlined and laid out is Jesus is better than what? So he starts and he says, he makes this argument in chapters 1 and 2 about Jesus being better than the other spiritual beings. He moves from that to talk about Jesus being better than Moses and the rest that was offered by Moses and Joshua in chapters 3 and 4. In chapter 5, he starts talking about Jesus being better than the priesthood. He first talks about the Levitical priesthood, then he goes back, especially in chapter 7, and talks about the priesthood of Melchizedek, who we'll talk more about in a few minutes, loops back around to the Levitical priesthood in chapters 8 and 9, and uses that as a springboard for Jesus is better than the Mosaic covenant. So he's better than the priesthood, but the covenant that he offers that underlies that priesthood is also better than the covenant of Moses. He talks about that in chapter 9 and into chapter 10. Chapter 11 is the famous Hall of Faith, or Hall of Fame of Faith, where he talks about all the different Old Testament heroes and lists the things that they did by faith. And the reason that he does that is he's getting to the beginning of chapter 12, where he says, since you have all of those examples of faith in the past, you should be looking to Jesus, who is the ultimate example of faith and the foundation of your faith now. And then chapter 12 and 13 is sort of the practical aspect, where he talks about how to be okay with suffering and discipline from a Christian perspective. And then in chapter 13, he talks about the more practical, like, exhortations of Christianity, like be hospitable, be kind to each other, remember that Jesus is the same yesterday, today, and forever, that kind of thing. So it's about Jesus being better than whatever we can come up with ourselves. That's basically what the letter is.
And for those at Westside who have been attending the Meditation Mondays, discussing Hebrews.
Yeah, we've been talking about Hebrews for over a year now in our Meditation Monday
it's
sessions.
been over a year.
Yeah. We meet once a month, and we've literally just gone, like, verse by verse through it. So we've been doing it for 13 or 14 months now. Right. And we're almost halfway through. We are going over this with a fine-tooth comb, to say the least.
Yeah, you ain't kidding.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I haven't been able to make all of them. I've made most of them.
Yeah.
I didn't get to go to this last one because of football.
Yeah.
I didn't get to go to the first few because of football.
Yeah. Last
year, because it started around this time last year.
Yeah, we started, I think, August of last year.
Yeah.
So we've done 13.
Yeah, 13 months. Yeah. So 13 sessions. Yeah. And so
14th is next month.
Correct.
If you're in the area and would like to join us.
Yes. Go to valleyBibleStudies.com. We don't put
That's
Meditation
us,
Monday.
Yeah. I mean, we don't put it on there, but you can find Westside through Valley Bible Studies.
That is true. Yeah. So with the Meditation Mondays, we've been going through Hebrews, and that is the overall theme. Mm-hmm. That Jesus is better than blank.
Yeah.
And with that being said, I mean, is there any specific spot you want to start with?
I don't want to totally skip chapter 1. The first one that stands out to me is in chapter 2. I like the opening of chapter 1, where he says, just starting in verse 1, long ago God spoke to our ancestors by the prophets at different times in different ways, but in these last days he's spoken to us by his Son. So even just in that opening thought, he's setting up the idea that the prophets of the Old Testament, the reason that they even had messages from God to give was because we're building to the message of the Son. And then he says, God has appointed him heir of all things and made the universe through him. The Son is the radiance of God's glory, the exact expression of his nature, sustaining all things by his powerful word. After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. You want to talk about an endorsement of Jesus? You can't get more holistic and more specific than that. Not only is he what the entire Old Testament was about, he's what all of creation is about.
Yeah. And it's also pointing out the fact that because of him, we have anything.
Right.
You know? And it goes into chapter 2 with that about our salvation and how we should treat it.
Mm-hmm.
Because here's the deal. If we forget or neglect or take for granted our salvation, essentially what we're doing is we are forgetting, neglecting, or taking for granted Jesus.
Yes. Because salvation doesn't happen without him.
Right. It's not without his sacrifice that we're able to at least have a chance.
Yeah.
Right? We didn't stand a chance before it, but now we do. And it's often easy to neglect that.
Mm-hmm.
Because...
Well, not even neglect, but just not think about it.
Right. Well, that kind of take it for granted because we get so wrapped up in day-to-day things. We get wrapped up in our own lives. And...
Well, and even at church, right? Like, sometimes you come to church, and if you're honest with yourself, there are days when you're there.
And you're just there. You're just there.
You're not there because, like you don't consciously think to yourself as you're going in, I'm doing this because Jesus died for my ability to do this.
Right. And you're not making it a conscious effort.
Mm-hmm.
You're just... And it's because we do it weekly.
Yeah.
It's because we get used to it.
And there are benefits to the routine, but there are also challenges.
Yes. And one of those being getting caught up in the motions.
Right.
And that goes into something that you have on a consistent basis. It's a lot easier to take it for granted.
Yes.
You know?
It's the same thing as like when you're growing up and your parents do things for you. You take them for granted sometimes just because you expect them, right? Like you're not trying to take your parents for granted, but like your parents have always been the ones who like cooked for you and took you to places you needed to go. And it's hard when that's the expectation sometimes to actively think about like the effort that they're putting in to do that. It's sort of the same mentality.
You know who we often often take for granted? Super easy to. Grandparents.
Oh, 100%.
Because, I mean, you think about it. You experience your grandparents, the presence of your grandparents, at a relatively young age.
Mm-hmm.
And
it's a much more voluntary thing than parenthood.
Yes. Because, I mean, they're related. But it's also more fun. Yeah. Because they don't have to worry about the discipline. They don't have to worry about, raising.
Spoil them and send them home kind of thing.
Yeah, fill them up with sugar and send them home. So if we have any young people listening, cherish every moment you have with your grandparents.
Yep.
Grandparents who are listening, do everything you can. But I mean, it's one of those things where you're going to love them regardless. And for someone who still has 3 of the 4, know that you are loved, even if it's not portrayed or even if it's not verbalized all the time. Because I'm definitely somebody that realized it relatively early on, that I didn't want to take my grandparents for granted, especially losing one younger.
Sure.
But yeah, there's my rabbit hole.
Yeah. I know my Grammy and Grampy listen to this, so shout out to y'all. Love y'all.
Oh, they're awesome.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah, they're super nice people.
So that idea of the family aspect of, the family, but also of Christianity, leads into what I was going to point out in chapter 2, which is verses 11 through 13. So just to read these. For the one who sanctifies, Jesus, and the ones who are sanctified all have one Father. That is why Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters, saying, and he quotes the Old Testament in verses 12 and 13, saying, I will proclaim your name to my brothers and sisters. I will sing hymns to you in the congregation. And again he says, I will trust in him. And again he says, here I am with the children God gave me. That idea that, like, when Jesus brings you into the church, and he does that when you're saved, the way that the New Testament says to be saved. When he does that, he's not just bringing you into an organization. He's bringing you into his family, like a family, but his personal family. He says, you are my brothers and sisters before God. You want to talk about something that shouldn't be taken for granted. Like that relationship that we have with God the Father and God the Son, is just so special.
And it's not just the fact that it's like a family or his family. It's the family that he started.
Yes.
You know, and so
he chose to come and bring us in.
I'm going to take this back to grandparents.
Mm-hmm.
There's always something really special. I try to, like family gatherings, especially like holidays, things like that.
Yeah.
I try to just look around, soak in certain moments. Like
those moments when you're just all together.
Yeah. Like, so Christmas time, I try to, when we're opening presents and everything, I try to just look around and truly try to soak in the moment. A lot of times I'll look at my grandmother and you can see the joy in her eyes because everything in that room came from her.
Yeah.
It came from my mama and papa.
Yeah.
They started it and we're all there because of them. Imagine how Jesus feels looking at his family. You know?
Yeah.
The people that love him dearly.
When we have the kind of unity and love that we're supposed to have.
Jesus, I mean, you can just imagine Jesus looking at us and just that, the sense of love and affection that he feels for the family that he started. And so I want to ask, so how do we, going back to making sure that we don't neglect our salvation, right? You've already said it in verse 11, right? How do we ensure that we don't neglect our salvation? Right?
Well, I think part of what he's going to argue for over the course of the letter of Hebrews is you work for it.
Yeah.
Right. Understanding that your work is not what earns you salvation, but
so
your participation in the family and your willingness to show up for the family and work makes a difference.
Right. So the word I was going to use is sanctification.
Yes.
That's how we make sure that we do not neglect our salvation.
Yes.
Is that we sanctify.
And there's there's a doctrine of sanctification that you can find all over the New Testament. We've talked about it a lot going through, especially the letters of Paul.
Yeah.
2 Corinthians is the one that I think of when I think of that process, because he talks there about, especially in chapters like 4, 5, 6, about what sanctification looks like when the Holy Spirit works together with Christians who have been saved by the Holy Spirit and given the gift of the Holy Spirit. Like, he encourages us in the process of like becoming better. So that sanctification process is something that, in a way, the Christians and the Holy Spirit work on together. Like, you're working on your relationship together in order to get closer.
And it's,
again, the relationship aspect.
And it's because we're set apart. Like, we don't have those opportunities if we're not Christians. We don't have those opportunities if we're not taking those steps and doing those things, taking the opportunities to set us apart.
So at the end of chapter 3 of Hebrews, there's an example that illustrates this, right? Starting in verse 16. He's been talking about the Israelites who under Moses wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, right? And eventually the generation that ended up being faithful received the rest of Canaan. And he's making the point that Christ offers a better rest. But starting in verse 16, for who heard and rebelled? Was it not all who came out of Egypt under Moses? With whom was God angry for 40 years? Wasn't it with those who sinned, whose bodies fell in the wilderness? And to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest, if not to those who disobeyed? Notice that in verses 16, 17, 18, all of those are action words, right? Disobedience, and those who sinned, and those who heard and rebelled. It's not just like thinking something, it's doing something. And the things that they did were wrong. Now verse 19. So we see that they were unable to enter because of, what does your translation say?
Because of unbelief.
Unbelief. Okay. Action that they did that was wrong is equated here to unbelief. Their lack of faith and lack of trust in God was demonstrated by their lack of action on his behalf and the actions that they did that were wrong. So you can't separate your faith from your action. Does that mean that your action earns you something in terms of like earning the rest of God? No.
No.
Because we can't do that.
Correct.
But you can't separate your faith and your action, or your lack of faith and your lack of action for God. That's sort of like when you talk about working to have a relationship with God, it's not that you're earning that relationship, it's that you can't claim to have that relationship and then not prove it. Because you wouldn't do that in any other relationship that you have. So he's making that point again.
Yeah. So going into chapter 4, it starts with this concept of what does God's rest look like.
Mm-hmm.
I love to rest.
Yes.
I do. I love it.
Big fan.
With a full-time job being a teacher and then football coach in the evenings and then having a 1-year-old and then doing this with you and then all kinds of stuff. I don't get to rest too often.
Right.
So I try not to take that for granted. However, this is a different look, or at least a different take on rest. So it talks about when God rested on the seventh day in verse 4, right, from all of his works. God did rest.
Yes.
And we often, when I rest, I do it because I'm tired. I'm doing it because I need a break from something or what have you. God didn't need to rest because he was tired. He did it, I think, because it was just like, I've done everything I've needed to do. I'm going to take a step back. I think it's that kind of rest. I don't think God got tired. I don't think God has the ability to get tired, physically at least. He probably has I don't know.
I mean, he understands what tiredness is because of Jesus.
Right. I think he might get fed up. I mean, we see that, especially in the Old Testament. He gets, but not the kind of tired and rest that we understand. And with this rest, so it goes into verse 5. Right, so verse 4 tells us about the seventh day he went into his rest from all of his works. Verse 5, and again in this place, they shall not enter my rest.
So it's not, the rest is sort of a state of being.
Exactly, which I find very interesting because, it's this simple mindset of what rest is and how we look at rest, to where when we enter into his rest is something completely different. And it's also something to look forward to.
Yes.
Going through chapter 4, unless you had anything else.
Well, you can't not look at verse 16 of chapter 4.
I was getting there.
All right, well then get there.
I wanted to see if you had anything else.
Not particularly. I mean, that verse is just such a good summary statement of everything he said so far.
Yeah.
And just a summary statement of what Christ's work on our behalf looks like.
Yeah. Also, you were almost about to skip verse 12. For the word of God is a living and powerful and sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing even to the division of the soul and spirit and the joints of and marrow. It is a discerner of the thoughts and intents of the heart.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that really just shows how powerful the word of God is.
Yeah. There are two big metaphors, one in Hebrew and one in James, so stay tuned for James in 2 weeks, and we'll talk more about the second one. But the two metaphors that are used to talk about the word, here it's the sword, and in James it's the mirror. So it's something that pierces, it's something that's used both for offense and defense as a weapon, but it's also something that reflects and shows you who you are.
Yeah. Yeah. So looking in, I'm going to start verse 14.
Okay.
We identify the high priest.
Yes.
There were priests. People had their priests. We're identifying
the high priest.
The high priest, being Jesus Christ. And then going into verse 15, for we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, meaning Jesus understands.
Right.
Jesus gets it. He's been through it. He knows.
Like what we were saying,
exactly,
does God know how to be tired? Yes, because Jesus was tired as a man.
Right. And it even points out, in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. There's a lot of things within the Bible that, obviously, there's a lot in Jesus' life that we didn't get.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we don't know about it.
I don't remember what the exact number is, but it's something like if you add up all of the days that we get pictures of Jesus in the 4 Gospels, it's like 3 months of his life.
Yeah.
And he lived to be like
33-ish. That's
nuts.
wild.
Yeah.
So we didn't get to see all the laughter. We didn't get to see all the tears. We didn't get to see the growing up. We didn't get to see the arguments. We didn't get to see the love, the laughter, all of the above.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We didn't get to see all of the temptations.
Mm-hmm. But they were there.
They were there. And that always is kind of
if you're tempted with anything, Jesus has had a temptation similar to it.
Right. My mind has always been wrapped around that because we only read about certain scenarios where Jesus was tempted.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Satan.
The big one is Matthew 4 and Luke 4,
right,
where Satan shows up.
Right.
But think about like the temptation of the cross, like the temptation to give up.
I give up all the time.
On stuff way less important than
right.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's not my life at stake.
Right.
You know? And so to say that Jesus was still tempted in the way that we are, it makes me feel even less worthy.
Yeah.
Because I'm struggling with these smaller things where Jesus, like you said, was tempted with the cross.
Yeah.
You know?
Not just the physical torture, but also he became sin for us on the cross.
Yeah.
The idea that
he took on all of it.
He would choose to be separated from God his Father in that moment on our behalf.
Yeah.
Is incredible. And then verse 16.
And then verse 16, let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need.
I think the big word there that stands out to me is the word boldness. Because what he doesn't say is come in like you own the place, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, don't come in assuming that God's going to give you what you want. That's the Pharisee and the tax collector, the metaphor that Jesus uses in Luke 18.
Right.
The Pharisee is there and saying, I'm great, I did all this great stuff. And the tax collector says, like, he won't even look up to heaven, and he says, Lord, be merciful to me, a sinner. That's the difference. It's not you come in thinking that you've earned a way in or thinking that, like, you're there because of you. But you're able to have the boldness that you can have before God because Jesus, as your high priest, works to give you that ability.
And I think it's the boldness because you know you're not worthy of it.
Yes.
Right? Like somebody that comes in and I think that they're bold, like, oh, this guy's bold. They're, how do I say this? They're portraying it in a way to where they have confidence, but it's misplaced.
Yes. Well, and he even said, like, the choice of words here, we may receive mercy, that we may find grace.
Yeah.
It's something that's given.
We're not earning it.
Mm-hmm.
We are pleading for it.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason that we are bold is because we have to plead.
It has to, right. It has to be something that's given. It can't be taken. But our boldness comes from the fact that Jesus has given us a reason to be there.
Yeah. Because again, as we've already said, without Jesus, we don't have a shot.
Yep. So again, he continues with the idea of Jesus as the high priest into chapter 5. Mm-hmm. Here's what's interesting about the end of chapter 5. Right? He's making this argument about Jesus being the high priest. He gets to the name Melchizedek, which is a name that his original audience probably would remember more readily than we do because they're a lot more familiar with the old law than a lot of us are. And he stops when he gets to Melchizedek. And he says, now we have a lot to say about this. This is verse 11. And it's difficult to explain because you have become, my translation says, too lazy to understand.
Mine is dull of hearing.
Right. You're choosing not to listen.
Yeah. Like at this point, it's...
Your immaturity has become a choice.
Yeah. Yeah. It's the mindset of, I get it, I've heard enough.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Although by this time you ought to be teachers, you need someone to teach you, again, the basic principles of God's revelation. You need milk and not solid food. Like, you should have grown to the point that we can have this conversation at this point. And he does come back around. Like, chapter 7, he starts that conversation again. But he's making the point that at some point, spiritual immaturity is a choice.
Right, because it's that difference between the milk and the solid food.
Yeah.
You know, the milk is just something that is, it's only for to help sustain, right? It's not going to help grow a lot. It's not going to make you stronger. It's going to keep you as strong as you need to be for that time.
Right.
Right? You know, milk is good, right? Steve from Covington, he gets it, okay? The milk is good. However, you need to move on to the solid food in order to actually grow.
Right.
And they're not making that progression.
That's a choice.
Right. You have to choose, you know, how do I say this? You have to choose to want to choose.
We talked earlier
does that make sense?
Yeah, we talked earlier about, like, you expect when you're a kid, like, mom and dad will feed you. At some point, you got to feed yourself.
At some point, you have to say, I got this. At some point, you have to say, I'm going to at least try.
And he goes into chapter 6 with that in mind. And chapter 6 is largely a warning about falling away in general, specifically falling away from what he calls the elementary principles of Christianity. And Steve from Covington, who you mentioned a few minutes ago, did an excellent series on those elementary truths on his podcast. What's the exact name of the podcast again? It's Sound Biblical Doctrine Covington VA.
I couldn't tell you. I just click on it on Spotify.
Yeah,
I can't tell you the name of it.
But Steve does a fantastic job on his podcast.
It's the logo of the church building.
Yeah,
I don't know the name of it.
It's Sound Biblical Doctrine from Covington. It's something very like that.
Yeah.
We'll link it. Do we have it linked on valleyBibleStudies.com?
We ought to.
We don't already. We should.
The two we ought to have linked are the Covington one and Sunseed. No, Sundrop.
Sundrop.
Not Sundrop.
Yeah, it's Sundrop.
It's SON. Yeah, Sundrop.
Yeah, SON.
Yeah,
drop.
with
Anyway.
Yes.
The point being, Steve did a great series in his podcast on what those elementary principles are.
Yes.
So absolutely go listen to that series. But in the context of chapter 6, what he's saying is that's what you stand on. Like as you're progressing towards spiritual maturity, that's the foundation. That's what you can't forget.
And let me tell you, man, it's different for everybody. Choosing is no, hear me out. Choosing is different for everybody because not everybody adapts to that well.
Right.
Okay.
The things those things that you hold to aren't different for everybody.
No.
Yeah.
Those are.
But the choice, what that choice looks like, looks different.
Correct. Because there are some. So, for instance, I was very. My mother has talked about this plenty of times. My mother's the kind of person, if she tells a story once, she's going to tell it forever.
It's very true.
And
love you, Julie.
Yeah. And she said before, growing up, I was very independent.
Mm-hmm.
I always wanted to do my own thing. As soon as I could drive, I didn't want to ride with anybody else. I wanted to go on my own. One of the big reasons I went to Freed-Hardeman out of high school was to be on my own.
It's 9 hours from here.
It's not. Yeah,
it's a long way from here.
Yes. I wanted to be able to go somewhere where I was just not at home anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So I could be on my own, whether that was playing college football at XYZ or being 9 hours away from Freed-Hardeman or at Freed-Hardeman.
Full disclosure, that's one of the reasons that I came here as the intern the first time I did, because it was far from where I was used to, and I wanted to see, like, I was used to Middle Tennessee, like that culture around the church. I wanted to see something different than what I was used to.
I still have those notes.
I'm going to get those notes.
No, you're not.
Yes, I am.
No, you're not. But for others, so I'll throw my little brother Josh under the bus. Josh was not independent. Mm-mm. It took everything. Like, Josh didn't want to drive. Josh didn't want to get his license. Josh was, he always has someone do something for him. And it's not that he can't. It was that he, not currently, Josh is a big boy now, but that Josh, he always just didn't want to.
Yeah.
And he'll tell you that, and so it's
especially
just that,
when you're a kid, a lot of kids handle that differently. Like the idea of progressing towards adulthood is easier for some than others.
Well, it's also like, by the way, the middle child syndrome is a real thing. Okay. I think one of the reasons Josh didn't want to do much is because he didn't have to do much. The reason I wanted to do much was because I was allotted that opportunity.
Yeah.
Being the middle child. Not to say that my parents love me any less, though sometimes I felt like it. I'm kidding. I love you, Mom.
Wow. I love you too, Todd. Good grief.
Dad, no. All right, here's the thing. Dad was straight across the board with all three of us. Josh got off. He got let loose with a couple of things that we probably wouldn't have growing up with Dad, but for the most part, he was pretty consistent. So I'm not going to, yeah.
I was just saying, you love Mom all the time. You never say you love your dad.
He knows.
You jerk.
No, he knows.
Okay.
As I've gotten older, I've realized, oh, I am my dad.
That's true. You are Todd Jr.
Yeah.
100%.
And with that being known, I've come to appreciate him a lot more.
Mm-hmm.
So appreciate you, Pops. All right.
Anyway, so he takes that break. He says, don't fall away from the elementary principles. Chapter 7 is the chapter about Melchizedek. For time's sake, ironically, we're not going to get super into Melchizedek. That's ironic because, like, in the Meditation Mondays that we've done so far, we've been joking about how, like, that's what we're going to really delve into, and we have.
Yeah.
So we're actually in Chapter 7 still on Meditation Monday. So if you come in a couple weeks, that's what we'll be talking about still. But the basic points about Melchizedek is that Melchizedek is
from Salem, and so are we.
Well, yes. Different Salems, but yes.
Yeah.
Melchizedek is a priest in Genesis. Melchizedek comes and blesses Abraham. He's called Abram then, but blesses the guy who will eventually be called Abraham. When he does that, right, that's the only thing we know about Melchizedek from the Old Testament. And then
Isn't that crazy?
And then there's one verse in the Psalms that says, like, I will bless you with the priesthood according to the order of Melchizedek.
And then here we are in Hebrews.
And that's it.
And
he builds a whole point off of that because, like, part of the point is we know nothing about Melchizedek. We don't know where he came from. We don't know what happened after him, after he blesses Abraham.
And guess what?
He's sort of a question mark.
Guess what?
Same is true of Jesus.
Guess what?
What?
We don't have to.
We don't have to. Right.
And that leads us into the later chapters. I'm not wanting to skip 7, 8, and 9 or anything like that. But going
Melchizedek's not the point.
Exactly. Like
Christ is the point.
In chapter 10, right, it really tells us about living by faith.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you get later into the chapter around verse 20, like 6-ish, right? Living by faith. Those who they didn't have, like those in the Old Testament, they lived by faith.
Yeah.
They lived on the promises that they weren't able to be a part of.
Right.
We have the promise.
Right.
Right? They lived off of the faith without the promises. We have the promises, and yet there are so many people that don't live by faith because they have to see the big, like they have to understand everything.
No,
We're not meant to understand everything. We are meant to know and have faith in the things that we are given.
Which is part of why Jesus came. In John chapter 1, he talks about Jesus being, you know, he says, no one has ever seen God, but the Son who came as a man showed us what God looks like, showed us who God is,
and
in a way that we can understand.
We see that in chapter 8, right? The
it's
new covenant
difficult,
is...
it's difficult to cover 7, 8, and 9 in this setting because there's so much background that you need. And the reason that is because he's writing to Hebrew Christians, right? But he's writing to people who know the old law really well. If
you check out the Bible study that Luke has made on valleyBibleStudies.com, you'll get that.
Yeah. Anyway,
that was just my way of telling people to check out your Bible study, man.
I know. I think it's a good study.
It is.
But anyway, like in 7, you have to know who Melchizedek is. In 8, like literally the last third of chapter 8 is a big long paragraph quote from Jeremiah 31. In chapter 9, he talks about like the specific like objects within the tabernacle and things like that. So there's a lot of this that is more fleshed out if you know the Old Testament references that he's talking about, which makes it more difficult for us to talk about here.
It does, which is why we're going to go to chapter 10.
Very good.
So I misspoke, by the way. 10:26 is about the just living by faith, right? Those who are living and trying to do what they're supposed to are doing because they're faithful to God, right? They're faithful to what is true. Okay, we're not faithful to something that is completely left field, and we just happen to be living the truth. That's not how that works.
Right.
That's not how that works. We live.
Once again, you have to tie your faith and your living together.
Correct. Where I was talking about the promises, that's actually at the tail end, or right about in the middle, excuse me, in verse 13 of chapter 11. But we'll get there in just a moment.
Yeah.
In chapter 10, the just living by faith. We know this. How do I want to put this? We know now what's coming.
Yes.
We don't know when.
No.
We kind of know how, but that's kind of all the information that we have.
Once again, we don't have to know everything.
And that is where
that's okay.
Faith comes in.
Mm-hmm.
That is how you live by faith. Living by faith is the uncertainty.
Right.
It's, I'm going to do this because I trust God, and I'm not really sure what's next.
You know what's interesting about, like, the fact that God chose to communicate to us through the Bible and wrote it when he did, right? Like,
yeah.
You have the Bible. At no point in the Bible does the Bible say, here's how a Christian should could responsibly use a smartphone, right? Like, here's how a Christian should navigate social media.
Right.
Those aren't conversations that are had in the Bible because, fun fact, it was written 2,000 years ago or more. So that wasn't part of the discussion. But my faith means that I can find, like, what I choose to live my life on is the principles that I find in this that will guide me through whatever situation.
Well, that's exactly what the Bible is. It's a foundation.
Mm-hmm. Basic instructions before leaving Earth.
Exactly.
B-I-B-L-E.
And so...
Old corny preacher joke for you.
You are the corniest of preachers.
I know.
But it is the foundation. It's everything we based everything off of.
Mm-hmm.
If I have a decision, so, I mean, and here we go. I promised when we first started this whole shebang, I would never bring this up.
Whoa.
But I'm going to bring up politics just for a moment.
Oh, man.
Give me a second.
Give me 30 seconds.
I have a degree in it, okay?
That's true.
We have our foundation, which is the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And we use that foundation in all the decisions that we make.
Mm-hmm.
That includes politics.
True.
You can have all of the debate and discussion and hoopla that you want about politics. And I love doing it just as much as the next guy. I have a degree in it, right? I taught government. I love talking about it. I love debating it. I think there is a right and wrong in most cases.
Mm-hmm.
However, as a Christian,
I'm a Christian first.
It doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
And especially when it comes to voting, I'm going to vote because I have a civic service.
I have a right that men have died for to give me.
Yes. And in an earthly perspective, I'm going to exercise that right.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm going to exercise it in the way that my foundation has set me up to do so.
I don't put my hope in politics or any political figure or anything the way that I put my hope in Christ.
There is no public policy that I'm going to put more faith in than I'm going to put in the Bible.
The only perfect public policy ever written is the Bible.
The Bible. And with that being said, when it comes to voting, because that's the biggest thing that we do, right? Mm-hmm. When it comes to voting,
we are a republic. That is how we exercise our power as the people.
Indeed, we are a representative democracy.
Mm-hmm.
I almost went down a rabbit hole.
Nope.
I'm not going to. But when voting, I'm voting as a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
I am an American, and I am voting for America.
But I'm a Christian first.
But I am voting as a Christian.
Yes.
So when I vote, what is going to align with my values?
You can almost think of
like
this discussion of being a Christian first. You can almost think of that as the flip side of like the theme of Hebrews being Jesus is better. Yeah. My response to that is, okay, then I'm a Christian before I'm anything else.
Absolutely.
Like, you're a husband, you're a father, but you're a Christian first. You're an American, but you're a Christian first.
I'm picking Jesus before I pick America.
Right.
And with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and pick for America.
Right.
With Jesus being the forefront of that thought.
You're a husband, you're a father, you're an American, you're a teacher, you're a coach, all of that, but you're a Christian first.
Amen. Which, stay tuned for next year because we're going to have an entire episode on
the church and politics.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And I'm really looking forward to it.
Yes. Okay, so with that in mind, like the idea of being a Christian first, having faith first.
Mm-hmm.
Chapter 11.
Yes.
The Hall of Faith.
Yes. Faith is a substance of things hoped for.
The evidence of things not seen.
Absolutely. What does that mean?
Yeah, that's
a
really nice tagline.
Here's the thing, man. I think it means everything that we just said.
Pretty much.
The foundation of having Jesus first and everything else, all the decisions made after that, is the fact that Jesus is first. Jesus is better. Mm-hmm. And with that in mind, I'm not sure about this. I'm not sure about that. If I have Jesus at the forefront of my mind, knowing that he is better, I have faith in him and everything else is going to be okay.
Right. So to say that a specific way, in a way that the Hebrews writer does, and this is a really nice, just little like mini sermon outline in one verse. Hebrews 11:6. He's talking about, he starts the list of the patriarchs, right? And he says Abel, Enoch, and in verse 7 he'll get to Noah. But in verse 6, he sort of pauses for a second and clarifies what he's talking about. And he says, now without faith, it's impossible to please God, because he who comes to God must believe that he is and that he's a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. What do we need to have faith in? We need to have faith in three things. He who comes to God must believe that he is. So you need to believe that God exists and that he is who he says he is. Number 2, you need to believe that God is a rewarder. So there are promises, there are gifts that God has given to certain people. Number 3, you need to believe that he's a rewarder of those who diligently seek him. So he is God. He is who he says he is, and that includes the promises that he's made. And he's given those promises to those who seek him with their lives. That's what faith looks like. Like that's, when I say I have faith in God, I have faith in those three things.
You preachers and your 3 points.
Just need a poem.
Real quick, I don't know if she listens. I don't think she does. If you know Miss Cassie Warner at the Lake Drive Church of Christ, Hebrews chapter 11 verse 4 was a memory verse from childhood that for some odd reason
you still know
has stuck out in my mind forever. Right? By faith, Abel offered to God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained a witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and through it, he being dead still speaks. Right? I haven't
it's
always
just one of those you've always known.
Of all the verses in the Bible for me to memorize, Miss Cassie Warner, you really drove that one into my head.
There you go. You got to have one. I feel like everybody who grew up going to Bible class and like having memory verses has one weird one.
That's mine.
That they just know.
So if you know Miss Cassie,
shout out to Bible class teachers.
If you know Miss Cassie Warner, let her know that I've given her a shout out, and then I love her very much.
Yeah. So again, chapter 11, Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, Joshua. And then he says, like in verse 32, what more shall I say? For time is too short to tell about Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah and David and Samuel and the prophets, and lists a bunch of other stuff that Old Testament figures did and that they went through because of their faith. Again, tying together you can't divorce your faith from the way that you live your life. And then the point, the conclusion of Hebrews 12 verses 1 and 2. Therefore, since we have such a great cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us lay aside every hindrance and the sin that so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God.
I kind of wish the writer of Hebrews had taken chapter 12 verse 2 and chapter 11 verse 1 kind of together. Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. The faith, who is, like, faith being Jesus, the author and founder of said faith.
Right.
That's just me.
Well.
Like, what is faith? Where does it come from? Jesus created it.
Well, that's sort of the whole point, is that he's getting to that through the Old Testament.
Right.
Like he's illustrating the fact that the Old Testament was sort of the map to get there.
Yeah.
But, okay, so 12 and 13 are sort of the practical, he sort of talked from a 3,000-foot view about, like, you have faith in this way. Faith influences your action in this way. You hold to the elementary principles of faith, which are these. 12 and 13 is where it gets practical. He talks in 12 about, like, let's see, verse 7. Endure suffering as discipline, because God is dealing with you as sons. For what son is there that a father does not discipline? That's tough in a lot of ways.
It's also a kind of shout out that children need to be disciplined by their fathers.
Right.
And it's also imperative that fathers are a part of the family.
Yes.
And they are the disciplinarians?
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's, that's a tough statement to grapple with when you think about the kinds of suffering that these people were going through at the time.
Yeah.
But, again, falling back on the family aspect of the church. Like, God is your father.
Yep.
God is the person providing for you. God is the person protecting you. God is the person allowing discipline when you've done wrong or when things just don't go well.
And at the end of days, if you have not obeyed your father, you will be disciplined.
Correct.
Forever.
And then, so he moves from that to verse 14. Pursue peace with everyone and holiness. Without it, no one will see the Lord. So, as you are enduring, we've said before, life is a lot of life is about perspective. How you view something makes a big difference. When you're suffering or when you're going through something hard, are you going to focus on the hard thing that you're going through? Or are you going to focus on your pursuit of holiness and peace, which makes that hard thing worth going through?
Well, and here's the thing. The hard things that you go through, it's not lost on us, especially in chapter 13, that you can't do it alone.
Right.
The very first words of chapter 13.
Let brotherly love continue.
Yeah. So that's kind of, and we've talked about that in multiple episodes of lifting each other up, edifying one another.
Because we can help each other see that better perspective.
Exactly. Because that's what, especially as a history teacher, I always say, it's always about perspective.
Right.
When you look at history, it's always about perspective.
Right.
You cannot progress if you don't have perspective. Everything is going to be one-dimensional if you never talk about the other dimensions.
If you think about like a national cultural perspective, nations and cultures don't progress unless the people in them have a shared vision.
Yeah.
You can say the same thing about the church. Like the church is not going to grow. The church is not going to edify each other. The church is not going to glorify God if we don't understand that God's vision is what we're holding to and do something about it.
Yeah. And the Hebrews writer later in chapter 13 kind of wraps up how to live righteously from 7 to 17, asks for prayers, which I don't want to say that we don't do enough of. I'd like to see more of it. Because typically when someone says, hey, pray for me, we're thinking something really bad is happening.
Yeah.
We got to be praying for one another regardless.
Mm-hmm. And part of that, like, being in this together is the ability to be vulnerable.
Yeah.
Like the ability to say, like, I'm struggling with X, Y, Z. Or even when you're not struggling, just say, like, I need prayer.
Yeah.
Because I can't do this by myself, and life is tough, and life is complicated.
Yeah. And so, I mean, right here, right now, for those listening, we ask for your prayers.
Absolutely.
Studying this stuff is making sure that we say the right things.
Mm-hmm.
Luke and I are not perfect in
far from it
any way, and we need help. Him and I help each other, but we need help. We need prayers from everyone that we can get. And
going back to 4:16, we have a reason to say those prayers.
Yeah.
We have a reason to be bold before God and ask for grace to help us in time of need.
Absolutely.
And that reason is Jesus.
Who is Jesus better? Yeah. Hey, we did it. Full circle. Any closing remarks?
That was like the best closing remark we could.
Fine. I thought I'd ask.
Come on.
Thank you so much for being with us here for this episode of Valley Bible Studies Podcast for Hebrews.
It's weird that we're like done with Paul now. Like I feel like
Aw.
we're moving on from the Paul mindset.
Yeah. And I like the Paul mindset because we're very rabbit hole kind of people.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Bummer.
But next is James.
It's pretty great.
Yep.
Looking forward to being with you then.
Written studies are on the website. Other podcasts that you should listen to, especially the two we mentioned, the Sundrop and then Sound Biblical Doctrine, are both on the website. You should look for those.
Sundrops with Kirk Sams.
Yep.
Is on the website. Make sure you look into that to give him a shout out. And we will see you in 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm. See you in James.